In the autumn of 1992, Delaware's quiet lanes were shrouded with a crisp stillness that only coastal towns know. Most nights, Wilmington remained swaddled in routine, the shuffle of papers at the Gazette echoing a city confident in the ordinary. But one evening, as the sky bruised purple and the ocean mist crept over Market Street, Thomas Brennan hunched at his desk over Thursday's obituaries. With stiff fingers and tired eyes, he scanned names and dates, the brief paragraphs of fading lives whose stories he'd stitched into the daily record for nearly 2 decades. He stopped cold when he saw her name, Sarah Mitchell, age 34. The words, beloved teacher, devoted sister, remembered for her laughter, were perfectly composed, but no one at the paper recalled receiving a submission from the Mitchell family, let alone an obituary about someone still very much alive. The date listed was tomorrow, October 16, 1992. The uncanny detail of her life, hobbies, and recent conversations flickered in Thomas's memory. She'd led the Gazette's literacy drive just last week. Teeth set on edge, he leaned into his desk, checking the origin of the typewritten slip. There was no sender, no envelope, just crisp white paper, as if it had always been there. Thomas made a call to the managing editor, his voice hushed. "Did you see this? We can't publish it. Sarah's alive." The response was uncertain, detached. Maybe it was a cruel prank, a morbid error. Perhaps someone meant to submit a different obituary and mistakenly filled in the wrong details. Thomas copied the text, tucking it into his jacket pocket, an uneasy talisman against what he couldn't explain. As midnight crept nearer, he walked home through silent neighborhoods, past familiar row homes with pumpkins grinning on porches. His thoughts kept returning to that paper. He reasoned, at each turn, why it couldn't be real. Yet the sense of foreboding pressed against him, heavier than the autumn gloom. At a quiet intersection, he caught a glimpse of 2 children standing beneath a flickering street lamp. Their faces were turned away, hands clasped, unmoving. He was about to cross the street, but paused, his instincts whispering for caution. The children, pale, dressed simply, seemed out of place in the hour's deep hush. One looked up as he passed. For a moment, Thomas's breath caught. Large, jet-black eyes stared from a face drained to warmth, observing with an intensity that chilled him. The boy tilted his head and whispered, just audible over the wind, "Help us." Thomas quickened his pace, not daring to look back. The Gazette's light still burned in his mind, but so did the ring of that uncanny voice. He reached his home, bolted the door, and sat beneath the yellow glow of his kitchen lamp, the unnatural obituary and the encounter chasing sleep from his head. By dawn, a new unease had seeped into Wilmington, and Thomas found himself wondering not how the obituary arrived, but what it had set in motion. Thomas woke after a fitful sleep, the memory of the black-eyed children haunting his thoughts like a warning. He tried to convince himself it was imagination. Maybe exhaustion made their eyes look so dark. Maybe the words he heard were the wind playing tricks. But as he dressed and headed out, every shadow seemed sharper, every glance from a stranger slightly too long. The town felt changed, as if something intangible but menacing had brushed over its streets during the night. Curiosity tugged him toward Claymont Elementary, where Sarah Mitchell taught. The schoolyard was busy with children, shouts of laughter echoing against brick walls. Thomas lingered by the chain-link fence, scanning for Sarah among the knot of teachers supervising recess. There she was, smiling, kneeling beside a child to tie a shoe. Alive, well, and unaware that her obituary lay on his kitchen table. He wondered how he could speak to her about it without sounding unhinged. He approached during lunch, the cafeteria abuzz with chatter and the smell of tomato soup. Their conversation was brief but revealing. Sarah had no knowledge of the obituary, no enemies she knew of, nothing peculiar occurring in her life. Her smile faltered when Thomas described the details written in the notice, especially the mention of a favorite poem she hadn't spoken about in years. "That's not just strange," she murmured. "That feels like someone's watching me." Thomas left the school troubled, burdened with a sense he was missing something crucial. He tried to retrace his steps from the night before, hoping to rationalize what had happened. As he rounded a corner near the Gazette's building, He saw a woman arguing with a postman over a missing package. The scene reminded him of the whisper from the child, "Help us." He began to notice more children with oddly old-fashioned clothes, always in pairs, always standing just far enough away that their features remained indistinct. Stories started circulating around Wilmington. Workers reported seeing small groups of children wandering late at night, faces obscured, never speaking unless approached. Kids at the school whispered stories to each other about strange visitors peering through windows. With each rumor, Thomas's anxiety grew. He confided in Annie, one of the Gazette's copy editors, hoping for the comfort of reason. She rolled her eyes, teasing him over his ghost story, then grew sober as he revealed the exact wording of the obituary. "That's wrong, Tom. I typed that page myself. It wasn't there yesterday," she said, her voice wavering. Together, they scoured the Gazette's records, but every trace of the original notice had vanished, as if it had never existed. Only Thomas's smudged copy remained. That night, unable to resist, Thomas returned to the place he'd seen the children, compelled by more than curiosity. A sense of unfinished purpose gnawed at him. The street lamp flickered the same uncertain orange as before, but tonight the children were gone. Only a folded slip of paper rested on the curb, waiting for him. Its words, simple and chilling, October 16th. "You cannot change what has already begun." The days that followed swept Wilmington into a subtle unraveling, a series of small disruptions that seemed insignificant alone, but, when woven together, hinted at something terribly wrong. People misplaced keepsakes, old photographs disappeared, birthday cards lost. Friends argued over odd misunderstandings, forgetting appointments they'd made only hours before. At the Gazette, missed deadlines and scrambled stories became routine, an undercurrent of tension coursing through the newsroom. Thomas clung to the original obituary page, feeling it as both a warning and a puzzle. His life became a string of carefully observed details: who walked which streets, which faces in the crowd he recognized, and where the shadows lengthened in unusual patterns at dusk. Through whispered conversations, he learned of other encounters with black-eyed children. An assistant librarian recounted a late-night knock at her door from 2 children seeking a phone, their presence suffocating, their eyes black voids reflecting only loss. She'd shut the door in a panic, and afterward felt as though her memories were leaking away, couldn't recall her dog's name or where she'd placed her wedding ring. Determined to understand, Thomas reached out to Sarah again. They met after school, sharing coffee in a rain-spattered diner. Thomas laid out his theory. The obituary was a message, not just for Sarah, but for Wilmington itself. He wondered if the children's appearances coincided with moments of emotional upheaval, loss, loneliness, regret. Sarah, visibly shaken, admitted to a recurring dream since the day Thomas first approached her. 2 children, faces blank, standing silently at the foot of her bed. Unsure how to protect Sarah or himself, Thomas intensified his search for patterns in the townspeople's reports. He built a map, marking every sighting and every subsequent small loss or memory slip. All of them spiraled out from the center of the city, fanning toward the coastal outskirts. It seemed the children followed invisible lines, connecting certain people to one another in an unspoken chain. At Annie's urging, Thomas brought his findings to the Gazette's editor, hoping to publish a warning. The editor dismissed the whole thing, attributing the warnings to mass hysteria sparked by Halloween rumors. "We don't need another satanic panic," he grumbled, tossing Thomas's map into the trash. Dismayed but undeterred, Thomas rallied Annie and Sarah. Together, they decided to focus on preserving everyone's stories, collecting written records in search of a critical link. On October 15th, the day before the obituary's date, Wilmington was buckling under the weight of its own anxiety. Parents kept their children home. Streets emptied early, blinds drawn, and doors locked. The uneasy anticipation spread through the city like a low-grade fever, everyone waiting to see what would happen when the clock struck midnight. Thomas, Sarah, and Annie barricaded themselves in the Gazette's archive room, the notice between them in the soft glow of a desk lamp. They didn't speak about it, but all felt a cold certainty. Whatever began with that obituary would reach its climax tonight. Midnight arrived in silence, blanketing Wilmington in a hush so profound it felt like the city had been pressed between two gloved hands. Thomas glanced at the clock, pulse racing. Sarah and Annie huddled beside him, all three unwilling to voice the fear thumping beneath their composure. A distant ring of laughter, children playing in the dark, echoed through the open window, too sharp in the midnight stillness. Suddenly, the Gazette's hallway lights flickered. A cold draft swept beneath the archive door. Footsteps, soft, deliberate, approached across the linoleum. Thomas reached for his flashlight, trembling. The door creaked open slowly, revealing two children on the threshold, featureless faces and eyes glossy black, absorbing the lamplight. They looked at him with patient expectation, unblinking. Annie whispered, "What do you want?" Her voice cracked. The children glanced at each other, then at Sarah, who instinctively recoiled. The girl spoke in a voice cold and flat, "We need your story." The air in the room turned dense. Sarah stepped forward, her own voice barely steady. "Why me? Why is my name on that notice?" The boy reached into his pocket and produced a crumpled page. It was the text of the obituary, identical in every way, but now with three names: Sarah Mitchell, Thomas Brennan, and Annie Torres. "We remember everything you try to forget," the boy whispered. "Your regrets, your secrets, your stories." Thomas felt memories peel away, childhood joys, heartbreaks, promises broken and kept. Annie gasped, clutching her locket, as if she might vanish if she let go. Sarah started to cry, but the children didn't move, only watched her grief with strange empathy. A wave of understanding bowled over Thomas. These were not harbingers, but collectors. Their appearances coincided with loss because they came not to take life, but to gather memories, to record the endings no one wished to write. The obituary was a prophecy only if the townspeople let their memories decay, their connections fray. Realizing this, Thomas forced himself to speak. "We're not ready to be remembered as gone. We're still here." Something shifted. The darkness in the children's eyes softened. The girl reached out, touching the desk, and every recorded memory in the archive glowed briefly. Letters, photographs, news clippings. The children lingered a moment longer, then turned to leave. When the room emptied, Annie sobbed into Sarah's arms, and Thomas pressed his palm to the obituary, now blank except for a final line: "It is not yet your time." The city outside began to stir, the tension in the air breaking. Daylight wasn't far off, and though Wilmington would never forget the autumn of the black-eyed children, for the first time in days, hope crept softly back into the world. Dawn broke over Wilmington with hesitant light, casting long shadows across streets still damp from overnight fog. Thomas sat at his kitchen table, the blank obituary notice between his trembling hands. Sleep had been impossible after the encounter at the Gazette. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw those bottomless black orbs staring back at him, patient and knowing. The children's words echoed in his mind. "We remember everything you try to forget." What did they mean by collecting stories? What happened to those memories once taken? Sarah called just after 7, her voice raw from crying. She'd been awake all night, replaying every moment of the encounter, trying to make sense of what felt like a narrow escape from something she couldn't name. They agreed to meet at Annie's apartment, needing the comfort of shared experience to process what had happened. The city around them seemed unchanged. People walked to work, traffic lights cycled through their colors, the ordinary rhythm of life continued. But for those who'd witnessed the children, Wilmington felt fundamentally altered, as if a thin veil had been pulled back to reveal something ancient and patient lurking beneath. At Annie's cramped living room, surrounded by stacks of books and mismatched furniture, the three of them tried to piece together what they knew. Annie had spent the early morning hours researching, pulling every reference she could find about similar encounters. "There are stories," she said, spreading photocopied pages across her coffee table, going back decades. Children with black eyes, always appearing in pairs, always asking to be let in or asking for help. Most people who encounter them report feeling drained afterward, like something vital was taken. Thomas leaned forward, studying the documents. Reports from Oregon, Texas, Vermont, scattered across the country, but sharing uncanny similarities. The children never aged in the stories, their appearances spanning years with identical descriptions. What struck him most was the aftermath. Witnesses often experienced memory loss, depression, a sense of profound disconnection from their own lives. "It's like they're feeding on something," he murmured. "Not life itself, but the pieces that make life meaningful." Sarah wrapped her arms around herself, still visibly shaken. "When that girl touched the desk, I felt something. It wasn't threatening, exactly, more like recognition. Like she understood loss in a way we can't." She paused, choosing her words carefully. What if they're not evil? What if they're just doing what they were meant to do, bearing witness to endings, preserving what would otherwise be forgotten? The idea settled uncomfortably among them. If the children were collectors of memories and stories, particularly those tied to grief and loss, then perhaps the obituary wasn't a death sentence, but an invitation. An invitation to what, though? To surrender their memories? To accept some predetermined ending? Thomas stood and walked to the window, watching families emerge from houses, children bundling into cars for school. "We need to understand why it stopped. Why they left when I said we weren't ready." He turned back to his companions. "And we need to know if others in town are still in danger." Over the next several hours, they made calls, visited neighbors, checked in with people who'd reported strange encounters. The pattern became clear. Those who'd faced the children directly and held on to their sense of self, who refused to surrender to fear or forget what made them who they were, had been left alone. But others, people already isolated, struggling with grief or regret, had experienced profound changes. A widower on Elm Street couldn't remember his late wife's voice. A teenager who'd lost her best friend in a car accident found entire months of shared memories simply gone. The children were still out there, still collecting, but they seemed to follow rules. They couldn't take what wasn't offered, couldn't force their way into lives that remained anchored in connection and purpose. The obituary, Thomas realized, had been a test, a way of identifying those teetering on the edge of surrender, ready to let their stories end before their time. As afternoon shadows lengthened, Sarah made a decision. We need to warn people, but not with panic. We need to help them hold on to what matters, their relationships, their memories, their reasons for being here. She looked at Thomas and Annie with renewed determination. We need to give them something stronger than fear to hold on to. They began planning that night, knowing the children would return. The black-eyed collectors never truly left. They only waited, patient as death itself, for the next moment of human weakness. Within 3 days, Thomas, Sarah, and Annie had transformed a small community center on Wilmington's west side into what they cautiously called a memory preservation project. The name felt inadequate for what they were attempting, a bulwark against something that defied rational explanation, but it served their purpose. They invited anyone who'd experienced the strange encounters or felt the creeping erasure of their own histories. The response surprised them. Dozens of people arrived, some skeptical, others desperate, all carrying the same haunted look of those who'd glimpsed something beyond ordinary understanding. The sessions began simply. Thomas encouraged people to share stories, to speak aloud the memories they feared losing. An elderly woman described her husband's laugh, the exact pitch and rhythm of it, how it had filled their home for 43 years before cancer took him. A young man talked about his sister, dead from an overdose, recounting their childhood adventures with such vivid detail that everyone in the room could see the siblings racing through summer fields. Sarah documented everything in careful script, preserving each story in multiple copies, distributed among the participants. What emerged from these gatherings was a portrait of a community far more wounded than Thomas had realized. Wilmington, like any town, carried layers of unspoken grief, job losses during the recession, families fractured by divorce or addiction, the quiet devastation of dreams deferred or destroyed. The black-eyed children seemed drawn to these fault lines, appearing most frequently to those whose connections had grown threadbare, whose reasons for persisting had worn thin. Annie noticed something crucial during the fourth session. A woman who'd lost her son in the Gulf War described an encounter with the children outside her home. She'd been about to invite them in. Their plea for help had felt so genuine when she'd glanced at a photo of her son on the hallway table. "I remembered his smile," she said, voice breaking, "and suddenly I knew that if I let them in, I'd lose that too. So I closed the door." Since then, she'd experienced no memory loss, no further visits. The pattern held. Those who maintained strong emotional anchors, who actively engaged with their memories rather than drowning in them, remained untouched. This discovery reshaped their approach. The gatherings became less about documentation and more about reconnection, helping people find reasons to hold on to their stories, to stay present in their own lives. They organized neighborhood dinners, facilitated conversations between estranged family members, connected isolated individuals with support groups. It wasn't therapy, exactly, but something more fundamental, rebuilding the web of human connection that gave memory meaning. Yet the children's presence never fully receded. Reports continued, always at night, always in pairs, always with that same patient, expectant gaze. Thomas began to see them as symptoms rather than causes, manifestations of the town's collective grief rather than external predators. They appeared where the social fabric had worn thin, where people stood at the precipice of giving up not just on life, but on the significance of having lived it all. One evening, Thomas encountered them again outside his own home. The boy and girl stood beneath the maple tree in his front yard, faces upturned toward his bedroom window. His initial fear gave way to something more complex, a kind of sad recognition. He opened his front door and stood on the porch, not approaching but not fleeing either. "You're still here," he said quietly. The girl's head tilted slightly, an almost human gesture. "There are always stories ending," she replied, her voice carrying surprising gentleness. "We wait because that is what we do. We remember when others cannot." Thomas felt the weight of that statement. These beings, whatever they were, served a function, preserving the emotional residue of lives cut short or faded prematurely, holding space for grief that had nowhere else to go. They weren't evil, just alien, operating according to logic that intersected with human experience only at its darkest margins. "Not tonight," Thomas said firmly. "Not in this house." The children regarded him for a long moment, those black eyes reflecting nothing, absorbing everything. Then, without a word, they turned and walked into the darkness between streetlights, fading like memory itself. Inside, Thomas locked the door and sat at his kitchen table. The community center's participant list spread before him. There were still too many names, too many people balanced on that terrible edge. The work wasn't finished, might never be finished, but for the first time since finding that impossible obituary, he felt something beyond fear. He felt purpose. October's end brought unseasonable cold to Delaware's coast, frost etching delicate patterns on windows and breath misting in the morning air. The Memory Preservation Project had grown beyond anything Thomas, Sarah, or Annie had imagined. What began as a handful of frightened people in a community center had expanded into a network spanning the entire city. Support groups, storytelling circles, neighborhood watches that served double duty as connection points for isolated residents. The Gazette, initially dismissive, now ran a weekly column featuring resident stories, giving public voice to private griefs. The change in Wilmington was subtle but unmistakable. People lingered on street corners to chat rather than hurrying past. The library hosted evening gatherings where older residents shared town history with younger generations. Even the schools incorporated the project, having students interview family members and create memory books. The fabric of community, which had grown threadbare through decades of economic decline and social fragmentation, was being deliberately rewoven, thread by thread, story by story. Yet the black-eyed children remained. Their appearances had decreased but not stopped, and Thomas had come to understand they never would. They were drawn to endings the way moths sought flame, not malicious, simply following their nature. What had changed was the town's response. People who encountered them now were less likely to succumb, armed with stronger connections and clearer purposes. The children's patient waiting became just another feature of Wilmington's landscape, acknowledged but not feared. Sarah had become the project's heart, her teaching background lending structure to their efforts. She organized training sessions for volunteers, teaching them how to help others articulate and preserve their most meaningful memories. Her own close call with the obituary had transformed her. She spoke more openly about her own losses, including a stillborn daughter she'd rarely mentioned before the children appeared. "I was forgetting her," Sarah confessed during one evening session, tears streaming freely. "Not intentionally, but grief hurt so much that I'd started pushing the memories away. Those children almost got in because I was already halfway to erasing her myself." Her honesty opened floodgates. Others shared similar experiences. The slow, self-protective amnesia that grief sometimes brings. The way pain makes people want to forget even the good memories that come wrapped in loss. The project evolved to address this directly, helping people hold onto difficult memories without being destroyed by them, finding the balance between remembering and drowning. Thomas spent his days at the Gazette and his evenings at the community center, running on coffee and purpose. Annie worried about his health, but he couldn't stop. The work felt essential, like he'd stumbled onto something larger than the immediate crisis, a fundamental truth about what kept people tethered to life and each other. He began writing about it, not for the paper, but for himself, trying to articulate what he was learning about memory, community, and the things that make existence meaningful beyond mere survival. One November evening, a week after Halloween, the project held its largest gathering yet. Over 200 people filled the community center, sharing food and stories, the room warm with conversation and connection. Thomas stood at the edge, observing, feeling something close to hope. This was what the children couldn't touch. This living, breathing network of shared experience and mutual support. Then he saw them. The boy and girl stood in the center's doorway, visible to him, but apparently not to others. They looked different somehow, less ominous, their black eyes reflecting the warm light inside. The girl met Thomas's gaze and did something he'd never seen before. She smiled. It wasn't quite human, that smile, but it held acknowledgement, perhaps even approval. They vanished a moment later, and Thomas understood. The children weren't the enemy. Isolation was. Forgetting was. The slow erosion of meaning that happened when people faced loss alone, without community to help them carry the weight. The black-eyed collectors would always exist, drawn to human endings, but they could only take what was already being surrendered. As the evening wound down, Sarah approached Thomas with a weathered envelope. "I found this in my mailbox today. No postage, just my name." Inside was a newspaper clipping, the original obituary, the one that had started everything, except now the text had changed. Instead of death notices, it listed births, weddings, achievements. A record not of endings, but of continuations. At the bottom, in that same unsettling typeface, "You chose to remember. We bear witness." Thomas folded the paper carefully, tucking it into his jacket pocket next to the blank version from that midnight encounter. Two sides of the same coin, ending and continuation, forgetting and remembering, isolation and connection. The choice, he now understood, had always been theirs to make. Winter settled over Wilmington with unusual gentleness, snow falling in soft curtains that muffled sound and softened edges. The Memory Preservation Project had become permanent, incorporated into the city's fabric so thoroughly that newcomers assumed it had always existed. The community center now bore a name, the Witness House, and served as a gathering place for anyone seeking connection or struggling to hold onto what mattered. Sarah had taken a part-time position coordinating its activities. Her teaching job adjusted to accommodate the work that had become her calling. Thomas continued at the Gazette, but his writing had evolved. He penned a weekly column about ordinary people's extraordinary stories, giving voice to the small triumphs and quiet griefs that composed daily life. His words reminded readers that their experiences mattered, that their stories deserved preservation and celebration. The column became the paper's most read feature, prompting letters and visits from people eager to share their own narratives. Annie had compiled years of collected stories into an archive, meticulously organized and duplicated, stored both digitally and in physical form. She'd become the town's unofficial historian, the keeper of memories that might otherwise have been lost. Young people sought her out for genealogy research, while older residents contributed their recollections, eager to ensure their lives left marks beyond fading photographs. The black-eyed children still appeared occasionally, always at the edges of awareness, always near those moments when someone teetered on the brink of surrender. But their presence had become something almost protective, a reminder of what happened when people stopped fighting to remember, when isolation won. Those who encountered them now often came to the witness house afterward, seeking the connections that would anchor them firmly in the living world. Thomas saw them one final time, on a clear January evening when stars burned cold and bright above the Delaware coast. He'd been walking home from a late session at the Gazette, his breath fogging in the freezing air. The children stood at the intersection where he'd first encountered them, exactly as they'd appeared that October night. But now he approached without fear, stopping a respectful distance away. "Thank you," he said simply. The words surprised him, but they felt true. These strange beings had catalyzed something essential, forced the town to confront its slow dissolution, to choose actively between connection and isolation. They'd been harbingers, yes, but also inadvertent teachers. The girl regarded him with those fathomless black eyes. "You were never ours to collect," she said softly. "Your stories were always too strong, too cherished. We come for what is already abandoned." "And if nothing is abandoned," Thomas asked, "then we wait. We always wait. But we are pleased to wait a long time in places like this." The boy gestured vaguely at the town around them, the lit windows and smoking chimneys, the evidence of life persisting. They faded then, not vanishing suddenly, but simply ceasing to be there, as if they'd been nothing more than shadows cast by passing clouds. Thomas stood alone at the intersection, the cold biting through his coat, and felt a profound sense of completion. The obituary that had started everything, that impossible, prophetic notice, had been both warning and invitation. It had forced them to choose what kind of community they wanted to be. He walked home through familiar streets, past houses where he knew the occupants' names and stories, where lights burned against the winter dark and lives continued their complicated, beautiful unfolding. The witness house would open again tomorrow, and people would come to share their joys and sorrows, to remember together what might be forgotten alone. The work would never be finished. There would always be new losses, new challenges, new moments when the fabric threatened to tear. But Wilmington had learned something crucial. Memory wasn't just about the past. It was about presence, about choosing actively to remain engaged with life and with each other. The black-eyed children collected abandoned stories, yes, but they couldn't touch those still being lived with intention and love. Sarah had been right that midnight in the Gazette's archive. They weren't ready to be remembered as gone. They were still here, still writing their stories, still choosing every day to be present for the people and places that mattered. And that choice, Thomas now understood, was the only real protection against the patient collectors who waited in the dark. The stars wheeled overhead, ancient and indifferent, as Thomas climbed his porch steps and unlocked his door. Inside, his home was warm, filled with photographs and books and all the small artifacts of a life deliberately lived. He hung his coat, made tea, and sat at his kitchen table, the same table where he'd first studied that impossible obituary, and pulled out a fresh notebook. There were more stories to document, more connections to forge, more reasons to keep choosing presence over absence. The black-eyed children would wait, patient as death itself. But Wilmington would make them wait a very long time. And that, Thomas thought, as he began to write, was exactly as it should be. Before you wander back into the shadows, make sure you hit that like button to keep these legends alive. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss another chilling tale from the dark corners of North American folklore. And whatever you do, activate the notification bell, because the next story might just be the one that keeps you up tonight. Stay curious. Stay brave.